He didn't wear a crown, he wore a uniform. But today, Colonel Goïta stands where kings once ruled, and he's reclaiming more than gold. He's awakening Mali's forgotten empire. And what terrifies France and the EU isn't what he says, it's what he's doing. Because this time, Africa's wealth won't be stolen quietly. Mali wasn't supposed to rise. It was meant to remain a fractured state, poor, dependent, and forever indebted to foreign advisors in polished suits who never stayed long enough to understand the dust. But in 2021, that script burned. Assimi Goïta didn't walk in with promises of democracy packaged in glossy brochures. He arrived with boots worn from battle, a soldier who had seen his people bleed while elites toasted in air-conditioned offices. His ascent wasn't a coup, it was a correction. And in that correction, the West saw danger. Because Goïta wasn't just taking power, he was taking back control. From day one, he sent a message no longer wrapped in apologies. French troops? Time to leave. Foreign mining deals? Time to renegotiate. IMF conditionalities? Time to reject. This wasn't diplomacy. It was detox. A nation detoxing from decades of colonial hangovers and post-colonial dependency. For France, Mali had always been a convenient partner. The gold, the uranium, the military bases, it was all part of an unspoken agreement. You pretend to govern, we pretend to help. But Goïta tore up that agreement, and he did it with clarity. We will no longer fight terror with foreign hands tied to foreign interests, he said, triggering shockwaves in Paris and Brussels. Suddenly, the Sahel was no longer a French zone. It was a sovereign front line, and Mali stood at the center. Goïta knew the cost would be high. Sanctions followed. Funding was frozen. Media began branding him a dictator. But he didn't flinch. Because unlike many who came before, he wasn't playing for headlines, he was playing for history. He remembered what Mali once was, a seat of empires, not a satellite of Europe. And slowly that memory became movement. French troops exited military compounds. Russian instructors arrived, not to control, but to assist on Mali's terms. National forces began reoccupying territories long abandoned to insurgents. For the first time in years, villagers saw uniforms that protected instead of terrorized. Roads reopened. Convoys moved with the local intelligence. And within months, zones marked as lost were marked again as home. But it wasn't just security Goïta targeted. It was wealth. Decades of mining deals had enriched foreign shareholders, while Mali's schools crumbled. Now contracts were reviewed, mines were audited, and revenues began flowing not to Paris banks, but to Malian ministries. It wasn't perfect, but it was a beginning, and that beginning scared people far beyond Mali's borders, because it proved that sovereignty wasn't an illusion. It was a decision, and once made, it reshaped everything. Goïta didn't speak like a reformer, he spoke like a builder, not of policy papers, but of futures. And in doing so, he awakened something long buried in the West African psyche, a hunger for dignity. This wasn't a rebellion, it was restoration. The restoration of voice, of value, of vision. Mali, once treated like a ward of the international system, was now daring to write its own rules. And in that defiance, Goïta became more than a president. He became a challenge to those who believed Africa must always kneel to be heard. He stood, and in standing, he exposed the fragility of the system built to keep leaders like him silent. Assimi Goïta knew that real sovereignty would never be achieved with slogans. It had to be anchored in wealth, controlled, protected, and used for the people. And in Mali, wealth had a color: gold. For decades, Mali was among the top gold producers in Africa, but its people remained among the poorest. Foreign multinationals, mostly based in Europe and Canada, extracted billions in precious metal, yet villages near those mines had no electricity, no clean water, and no schools. The government collected royalties, yes, but those royalties were calculated from rigged contracts that guaranteed Mali would always get crumbs. And those crumbs were paid late, or not at all. Under Goïta, this changed. He ordered a comprehensive audit of every major mining operation in the country. Licenses were suspended, accounts were frozen. French, Canadian, and even South African firms were summoned to renegotiate. Gone were the days when an official would be handed an envelope and told to look away. The era of open books had begun, and what Mali discovered shocked even its own economists. Billions had vanished. Tax evasion, underreported production, inflated expenses, all used to justify payouts so small they might as well have been insults. Goïta did not respond with noise. He responded with action. A new mining code was introduced. The state would now own at least 30% of every future mining venture. Strategic sites would be entirely nationalized. A sovereign mining agency was launched, staffed not with expats, but with Malian geologists, engineers, and economists. At first, foreign investors threatened to leave. Western embassies issued statements of concern. The IMF warned of capital flight. But Goïta didn't blink, because while foreign capital may flee, the gold wouldn't. It was still in the ground, and Mali would now decide how, when, and for whom it was extracted. Meanwhile, for the first time, communities near mining zones began receiving direct allocations of gold revenue through local councils. Rural clinics were renovated, boreholes were dug, women's cooperatives were funded. The people saw the difference not in speeches, but in services. And word spread fast. Across Bamako, a saying emerged: the gold is ours again. But Goïta was not content with reclaiming resources. He wanted to reclaim how value was stored, measured, and exchanged. So he did the unthinkable. He challenged the CFA franc, the currency controlled by France and pegged to the euro, used by 14 African countries. Economists had long debated its usefulness, but Goïta turned debate into action. Mali began preparations to exit the CFA zone, seeking to develop a national currency backed by gold reserves. Not theory, reserves that were now being counted, stored, and managed domestically. Critics laughed. They said the move would trigger hyperinflation, but they forgot one thing. Mali wasn't alone. Within months, Burkina Faso and Niger expressed interest in a joint monetary union, one free from European oversight. The alliance of Sahel states was not only military anymore, it was becoming financial. And France took notice. The French government summoned economic envoys, held crisis meetings, and launched media campaigns warning of instability. But the damage was done. The empire of influence was crumbling, not with tanks, but with terms. Goïta had redrawn the map of value. For years, Africa had been told that to grow, it must borrow. Now Mali was proving that to grow, it must own. And ownership begins with what lies beneath your feet. The gold in Mali was no longer a curse wrapped in contracts. It was becoming a foundation, one that France could no longer touch, one that the IMF could no longer leverage, one that Europe could no longer price in euros. And as Mali secured its future gram by gram, ounce by ounce, a deeper truth emerged. Independence is not declared, it's extracted. With gold back under national control and a new mining framework in place, Goïta turned his focus to what the nation needed most: transformation that could be felt not just in numbers, but in daily life. He understood that a sovereign state without an educated population would simply become a new version of the old model. So he launched the Rebuild the Future initiative, a country-wide push to restore, expand, and decolonize Mali's education system. Decades of dependency had left Mali with schools that taught foreign history better than local heritage, that measured intelligence through imported curricula while ignoring indigenous knowledge. Goïta's new education ministry rewrote the syllabus. Local languages were introduced alongside French. Agricultural science was prioritized over abstract theory. History books were revised to include Mali's real legacy, from the empires of Sundiata Keita and Mansa Musa to the betrayals of colonialism. In rural areas, solar-powered classrooms were built in weeks, not years. Young teachers were recruited and trained with national funds. A new teacher salary scale was introduced to reverse the brain drain. Goïta didn't want graduates who would flee. He wanted architects of a new Mali who would stay. Meanwhile, agriculture received the same urgent attention. For years, Malians had been told that food security would come from trade deals and imported wheat. But those deals had collapsed when sanctions hit. The shelves emptied. The message was clear: no sovereignty without soil. Goïta responded by launching the Feed Ourselves First campaign. He redirected funds from international contracts into local farming cooperatives. Instead of importing tomatoes from Europe, Mali began subsidizing tomato farmers in Sikasso and Ségou. Seed banks were created, irrigation channels repaired, government grants were offered to women-led farming projects. In just one planting season, domestic production of millet, rice, and beans surged by over 35%. The IMF didn't understand it. Their spreadsheets showed risk. But the children eating school lunches made with local grain didn't need spreadsheets. They needed food. And now they had it. At the same time, Goïta looked to technology, not imported gadgets, but digital sovereignty. Mali's IT ministry launched a national data center built and run by Malian engineers. Online services were localized, public portals for business registration, land ownership, and school enrollment were created in Bambara and other native languages. For a population long excluded from bureaucratic access, this was a revolution of access. A young entrepreneur in Mopti could now register her business without traveling to Bamako. A farmer could apply for a loan using his phone in Fulani. Bureaucracy, once a wall, was becoming a bridge. And every time that bridge reached someone new, Mali stepped further out of the shadows. But it wasn't just about modernization. It was about memory. Goïta ordered the restoration of national museums, libraries, and cultural centers. Oral historians were hired to record elders before their voices faded. Griots were funded to teach youth the songs and epics of their ancestors. For the first time, cultural sovereignty was being treated not as a luxury, but as infrastructure. It was part of a deeper war, the war against erasure. Because for too long, colonization hadn't just taken land and labor, it had taken stories. And Goïta was determined to return them. France responded with silence. European diplomats avoided public comment, unsure how to criticize policies that were clearly improving lives. Western media outlets began to ignore Mali altogether. If they couldn't spin the story, they'd rather not tell it. But inside Mali, the people felt the change, not in foreign currencies or PR campaigns. They felt it in their hands, their homes, their hunger satisfied, their language respected. For them, Goïta was not perfect, but he was present, and that presence was beginning to feel like power. As Mali redefined its domestic landscape, it was also redrawing its position on the global stage. Goïta understood that political independence without strategic realignment would leave Mali isolated and vulnerable. The West had made that clear through sanctions and silence. So Mali began building new alliances, not out of desperation, but out of design. The first pivot was toward Russia, a move that sent diplomats in Paris into frenzy. For decades, France had considered Mali its backyard. Military cooperation, language, trade, currency, it all flowed through French channels. But under Goïta, those channels were blocked. And in their place came new voices. Russian advisors arrived not as commanders, but as consultants. Defense strategies were restructured around local realities. Joint training missions focused not on regime protection, but on border defense and counterinsurgency. Unlike foreign missions of the past, these partnerships were not built on lectures, but on listening. China too stepped into the picture, not through military presence, but through infrastructure. New roads, dams, and fiber optic lines were planned with joint funding models. Unlike European aid, these agreements didn't come tied to reforms Mali didn't choose. They were transactional, not paternalistic, and that distinction made all the difference. Mali was no longer asking for help. It was defining terms. Goïta also reached out to neighboring African states, not just Burkina Faso and Niger, but Guinea, Chad, and even Algeria. What began as a loose network of anti-colonial regimes started to resemble something more coherent, a counterblock, a vision of African cooperation not centered around ECOWAS, but around shared sovereignty. The Alliance of Sahel States formalized protocols for mutual defense, trade, and migration. Border checkpoints became corridors instead of barriers. Goods flowed with fewer bribes, faster inspections, and greater trust. For ordinary citizens, it felt like the continent was waking up to itself. Meanwhile, ECOWAS floundered. Once a pillar of regional coordination, it had become a symbol of colonial continuity. Its leaders issued threats from conference halls in Abuja, but their words carried less weight with each passing month. Because while they debated resolutions, Goïta was resolving real problems. And while they held forums, Mali was building alliances. France tried to counter the tide. It ramped up its presence in neighboring Ivory Coast and Senegal. French-language media was flooded with warnings about Mali's direction. But the audience was no longer listening. In cafes, universities, and even military circles, the old narratives felt stale. Why should Mali return to the fold, they asked, when the fold had failed? Western think tanks published reports calling Mali's trajectory dangerous, unpredictable, even hostile. But what was hostile exactly? Feeding your people, keeping your gold, teaching your history, securing your borders? In the Sahel, those weren't acts of aggression. They were acts of survival. Goïta's foreign policy was not about revenge. It was about relevance. He knew Mali couldn't afford to be a pawn in someone else's chessboard. So he flipped the board. For too long, global politics had treated African nations as votes to be counted at the UN, as resources to be extracted, as crises to be managed. But now Mali was treating itself as a subject, not an object. It was choosing who to speak with, how to invest, and what battles to fight. And in doing so, it made itself unpredictable to the West, because true independence is unpredictable when you've only known control. This wasn't anti-Western. It was post-Western. And in the diplomatic cables sent from Bamako to the world, one thing was clear. Mali would no longer be warned. It would be respected or ignored, but it would not be stopped. What began in Mali no longer belonged to Mali. Goïta's defiance had triggered something deeper than politics. It had stirred a quiet rebellion in the hearts of millions across the continent, those who had long believed the system was rigged but never saw an alternative until now. In Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traoré echoed the same tone, demanding control over resources, rejecting Western intervention, and calling for a unified front. In Niger, a younger military leadership emerged, inspired by Goïta's model and emboldened by a population tired of being ignored. In Guinea, similar sentiments stirred. In Chad, protests erupted with slogans that mirrored Mali's slogans, "Our land, our rules." Across these nations, the dominoes began to wobble, not from violence but from vision. The alliance of Sahel states morphed from a tactical defense pact into an ideological axis. A new African identity was being born, not Pan-Africanism as a conference slogan, but as practice, as shared logistics, common currency plans, cultural exchange programs, and joint infrastructure projects. What connected these leaders wasn't age or ideology. It was a common wound and a shared decision to stop bleeding. For the West, this movement was hard to counter. Military threats would only prove the Sahel's argument. Sanctions were no longer effective. These nations had already adapted. They had begun trading outside the traditional financial routes. They had diversified partners, stored value in gold, bartered in fuel, and invested in internal production. The usual levers no longer worked, so the counteroffensive became psychological. International media flooded the narrative with fear. West Africa is unstable. Coups are dangerous. Democracy is dying. But the people living in these nations saw something else. Stability returning, food prices falling, corruption being punished, local officials being held accountable. They saw leaders sleeping in army barracks, not luxury hotels. They saw soldiers in the fields, not behind palaces. For the first time in decades, leadership was tangible. It wasn't a myth. It was a man in uniform repairing a well, a woman in a government post returning to her hometown to rebuild a school. These stories weren't in foreign reports, but they were in every conversation in every marketplace. The gap between image and reality had never been wider. And in that gap, the West found itself powerless. France, the EU, and their allied institutions began hosting emergency summits. They debated restoring influence. They released strategy papers on engaging a changing Sahel. But Goïta didn't wait for their engagement. He hosted forums in Bamako, forums with no Western presence, panels on economic restructuring, youth empowerment, and traditional leadership roles. Delegates came from across Africa, Latin America, America, and Asia. The message was clear. The future isn't in protest. It's in construction. That construction was already underway. Goïta launched the Sahel Innovation Fund, seed capital for engineers, farmers, and educators building solutions on African soil. He offered microloans to young women with business ideas in textiles, solar power, and agritech. The West watched, puzzled. This wasn't the chaos they expected. It was calm. It was organized. It was working. Mali was not collapsing. It was composing a new chapter, and the melody was spreading. Young Africans began citing Goïta in speeches, writing essays about his reforms, drawing murals of him next to Sankara and Lumumba. Not because he was perfect, but because he dared. He dared to say no. He dared to say enough. And that dare was now an anthem. France tried one last move, invoking treaties, calling for ECOWAS to intervene. But even ECOWAS was splitting. Nigeria was facing its own crisis. Senegal was uncertain. Ghana remained silent. The bloc was no longer bloc-like, and the voice of the people was louder than their declarations. In Mali, the anthem continued, not in brass bands, but in rice fields, in solar plants, in renovated schools. Sovereignty was no longer a speech, it was a system, and Goïta had shown the world how to build it, brick by sovereign brick. The European Union and France, once the architects of West Africa's political rhythm, now found themselves watching helplessly as the beat changed. Every month that passed, their influence receded, not with a bang, but with a silence they couldn't interrupt. The CFA franc was being questioned in boardrooms they could no longer access. Military cooperation agreements were being rewritten or revoked. Trade routes once dominated by French companies were shifting eastward toward Algeria, Turkey, and China. But what struck Paris hardest wasn't the loss of business, it was the loss of control. For decades, control had not come from force. It had come from familiarity, from diplomats speaking fluent French, from local elites educated in Paris, from contracts written in European legalese. That architecture had allowed France to pull strings without appearing to hold them. But Goïta had cut those strings in full daylight. He didn't disguise his decisions. He didn't pretend to consult. He acted. And in doing so, he shattered the illusion that influence required subtlety. Suddenly, the embassies weren't being invited to state functions. French NGOs were being audited. European security experts were told their contracts were no longer needed. And the silence from Bamako grew louder. France responded with fury dressed as diplomacy. It issued warnings, froze cooperation agreements, recalled ambassadors. But none of it slowed the momentum, because Mali had spent the last 2 years building alternatives. With every door France closed, Goïta opened another, this time with no colonial shadow behind it. Turkey sent engineers, Russia provided wheat, Iran offered medicine, Algeria opened its markets to Malian textiles. These weren't handouts, they were deals. Negotiated in full daylight, with Mali as an equal. In Brussels, the European Union tried to spin a narrative of concern. They spoke of human rights, of transparency, of democratic order. But their timing betrayed them. These concerns had never appeared when puppet governments signed away goldfields or accepted rigged elections. They emerged only when Mali stopped obeying. The contradiction was too obvious, and in West Africa, too insulting. Goïta never claimed moral superiority. He claimed a reality. "You had 60 years," he once said in a press conference, "and you spent them managing our failure. Now we will try managing our own future." The room went quiet because there was no counter-argument. The data showed it: literacy rising, infant mortality falling, agricultural output climbing, crime down in recaptured territories. Foreign embassies couldn't explain it. Think tanks ignored it. But Malians lived it. And what they lived, they trusted. In rural towns once flooded with imported food, markets now sold local grain. In cities once defined by slums, new housing cooperatives emerged, funded not by World Bank loans, but by revenue from nationalized industries. At night, young men gathered in corners, not to plot protest, but to plan businesses. The fear was evaporating. In its place, purpose. France increased its media presence, sponsored documentaries, funded influencers. But the message fell flat. Mali's story was no longer being written in Paris. It was being filmed on the streets of Bamako. And the authors were not analysts. They were drivers, nurses, mothers, students. The ones who had waited the longest. The ones who now had something to lose, and so fought harder to defend it. Goïta didn't need to say it anymore. The people said it for him. Leave us alone. We're finally breathing. And in that breath, there was no room for old empires. As the West recalculated its strategy, Goïta recalibrated Mali's role, not just as a nation under siege, but as a regional anchor for a new vision of African statecraft. This wasn't about rejecting the international order. It was about demanding a place in it not as a recipient, but as a participant. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs was transformed from a desk-bound extension of Parisian influence into a strategic planning center. Diplomats were no longer chosen based on foreign education, but on experience in community leadership and negotiation under pressure. Goïta wanted realists, not rhetoricians. Mali began sending delegations not just to Geneva and New York, but to Addis Ababa, Algiers, Tehran, and Jakarta. The world was suddenly reminded that Africa is not a periphery, it is a pivot. In ECOWAS meetings, Mali no longer showed up quietly. It showed up with proposals. Peace missions not led by France, but by African mediators. Regional trade routes that didn't pass through European ports. Shared digital infrastructure for West African data centers. These weren't dreams. They were drafts, budgets, working groups. And while ECOWAS fumbled with condemnations, Mali built frameworks. The AU took notice. So did CARICOM, the non-aligned movement, and ASEAN observers. Because in a fractured global order, a self-sufficient Africa was no longer theoretical. It was valuable. France and its EU allies increased pressure. They tried to activate the West African standby force. They appealed to the African Union for sanctions. They lobbied the UN for resolutions. But each effort exposed their weakening hand. Member states were reluctant. Public opinion was shifting. Analysts in Ivory Coast and Ghana began questioning whether ECOWAS was defending democracy or just defending interests. And in every panel, the same unspoken truth lingered. If Mali could stand, so could we. That fear wasn't about Mali's strength. It was about its influence. Goïta's leadership wasn't exported by force. It spread by example. And that example was everywhere. His face on murals in Dakar, his quotes in WhatsApp groups in Ouagadougou, his story told in classrooms in Conakry. Not because of propaganda, but because of resonance. He spoke a language people had longed to hear. No more humiliation. That language didn't deny mistakes, it admitted them. It didn't promise utopia, it promised work. But it also promised that the work would be ours, that sovereignty wouldn't just be about currency or contracts, it would be about confidence. In courts, Mali began to prosecute corruption, not selectively, but systematically. Judges were protected, police were retrained. The rule of law wasn't perfect, but it was visible, and that visibility became legitimacy. In villages, elders spoke of Goïta not as a ruler, but as a restorer. He brought back something they thought was gone: accountability. Even in places where the state had collapsed years before, clinics reopened under local management, supported by national funds. In territories once claimed by insurgents, negotiations were held by Malians, not intermediaries. The message was clear. We don't negotiate with guns. We negotiate with ground. You either build here or you leave. That firmness didn't escalate war. It de-escalated absence. Because the state returned, not as force, but as function. And in doing so, it reclaimed what had been surrendered. France could not comprehend it. The EU could not match it. The West could not rebrand it. Because this wasn't a movement they could infiltrate or replicate. It was rooted in history, pain, and agency. It was not imported. It was inherited. And Goïta, by refusing to be the next chapter in a tired book, had started writing a new one in which Mali was no longer explained. It explained itself. Inside Mali, a quieter revolution was taking place, one that didn't make headlines but changed everything. It was a revolution of trust. Goïta knew that no matter how many mines were nationalized or how many roads were built, Without public belief, the state would remain an outsider to its own people. So he began the harder work, the restoration of civic dignity. It started with listening. Ministers were sent on listening tours, not to campaign, but to sit in mosques, markets, and village squares. They didn't bring promises. They brought notebooks. They recorded grievances about land disputes, teacher absences, and unpaid pensions. And then, shockingly, they followed up. Schools that hadn't received textbooks in years were restocked. Civil servants who had extorted villagers were publicly removed. Cases of land theft by elites were reopened and tried in mobile courts. Suddenly, the law wasn't something distant. It was showing up on motorbikes, in dusty courtyards, wearing dusty uniforms. Not to punish, but to protect. Citizens began to talk about the government not with fear, but with expectation. They demanded things, and their demands weren't dismissed as chaos. They were treated as citizenship. Goïta encouraged it. He told his ministers, if the people stop complaining, they've stopped believing. That belief had been extinguished long ago, but now it was flickering again. Young people who once dreamed only of migrating to Europe began registering cooperatives in farming, construction, and crafts. They applied for microloans from new state funds. They organized cleanup campaigns in cities and literacy drives in villages. Civil society had not been crushed. It had been uncaged. Women's groups emerged as major forces, not the Western-funded NGOs, but grassroots mothers' unions that demanded safe streets, maternal care, and markets free from harassment. In Bamako, women blockaded a corrupt city office until it was restructured. No police were called. The minister met them personally. Their list of demands was signed into law. That moment traveled like wildfire. It wasn't just that change was possible, it was that change now had a process. And that process didn't require permission from Paris. It required participation from Malians. The media, long filled with foreign press releases, began filling its pages with local victories. A midwife who had delivered 500 babies without electricity received national recognition. A teacher who ran night classes under a tree received new housing. These stories weren't orchestrated, they were observed, and they reshaped the imagination of what leadership meant. Goïta wasn't presented as a saint. He was shown as someone trying. And in a region tired of tyrants and technocrats, trying was revolutionary. Across government, a new language emerged, service, not status. Ministries competed not for budget size, but for impact reports. Annual performance reviews were published in public. And failure was no longer hidden. It was explained, addressed, and where needed, punished. This was more than transparency. It was a culture shift. Malians began to believe not in miracles, but in process, that roads didn't appear overnight, but they did appear. That corruption didn't vanish, but it could be confronted. That poverty didn't end in a speech, but it could be reduced by steady hands. This realism became the new hope. It wasn't loud, it wasn't flashy, but it was durable. And it redefined what success looked like. In Mali, success was no longer a foreign grant or a glowing article in a Western paper. It was a working borehole, a paid teacher, a functioning clinic, and in that redefinition, Goïta had achieved something few leaders ever do. He changed the emotional contract between the people and their state. He replaced resignation with responsibility, fear with faith, and that change, though quiet, was irreversible. By the third year of his leadership, Goïta had become more than a figure of defiance. He had become a mirror. In him, millions saw not a savior, but a reflection of their own forgotten strength. Mali, long seen as the fragile epicenter of African instability, had become something unexpected, a prototype, a case study not in failure but in courage. And that courage was now spreading. It echoed in the speeches of other leaders who once stayed silent. It was scribbled in the notebooks of university students across the continent. It was hummed in the songs of market vendors who now sold their goods under newly lit streets. This was not the Africa the world expected. It was the Africa the world had tried to prevent. Independent, intelligent, and intentional. Goïta never claimed perfection. His government still faced challenges, logistics, inflation, sabotage. But even in those stumbles, there was transparency. A minister who mismanaged funds was fired, publicly. A national project that failed to meet standards was halted, revised, and relaunched. In every step, the message was clear. Mali is no longer afraid of itself. It is no longer waiting for blueprints written in Brussels or strategies from Washington. It is writing its own, and that authorship was now the greatest threat to the old order. Because once a people see themselves as builders, they stop accepting the role of beggars. France tried to regain relevance. It offered to restart dialogue. The EU promised new partnership frameworks. But Mali didn't answer immediately. It wasn't because of anger, it was because of clarity. Partnership must be earned, not assumed. The rules had changed. Mali now sat at the table not with a cup in hand, but with terms on paper. If the West wanted engagement, it had to come with humility. The age of lectures was over. In schools across Mali, children now learn not just about French revolutions, but about the Songhai Empire, the women of Ségou, and the astronomers of Timbuktu. History was no longer a tale of victimhood. It was a library of resistance. And with every textbook rewritten, a narrative was being rebuilt. One where Africa was not a continent of chaos, but of consequence. Goïta's speeches were no longer broadcast just on national TV. They were dissected in universities in Nairobi, studied in think tanks in Pretoria, quoted in activist circles in Accra. Because what he had proven was not just that reform was possible, but that it was ours to begin. No foreign nation had offered to build Mali's clinics, fix its currency, or decentralize its agriculture. Mali had done it. And in doing so, it reminded the world that African solutions aren't born in silence. They're born in struggle. And when the struggle is led by those who listen, those who serve, those who remember, the people respond with loyalty, with labor, with love. As Goïta stood before the Malian flag on the anniversary of independence, his words were simple. We are not yet where we want to be, but we are no longer where they left us. The crowd roared, not for him, but for themselves, because they knew the truth. The gold in the soil was never the true wealth. The true wealth was belief. And now, finally, it was theirs again. Mali had risen, not with foreign aid, not with applause, but with its own hands. And the world, whether it wanted to or not, would have to take notice.